Welcome back to another lecture, everyone. So in this lecture, we're going to be looking at the appendicular skeleton. So in previous lectures, and in previous videos, we've looked at the axial skeleton, that being the bones that make up the midline axis of the body. Now we're going to take a look at the appendicular skeleton, which are essentially all of the other bones, and namely the bones that make up our upper limbs and the other bones that support the upper limbs, and then the bones of the lower limb and the bones that support those as well. All right. So first off, before we look at the specifics of the bones of the upper limb, we're going to look at some patterns. All right. So we see common patterns across um, various different animals of various different types, right? So we see this in reptiles, we see this in fish, we see this in mammals and bats, and so bats are types of mammals, right? We see this in birds as well. And this pattern is one bone, two bones, many bones, and then digits. All right. So what we see here is across all of these. So whether we're looking at a human, a lizard, cat, whale, bat, frog, or bird, we see the same basic pattern. All right. Now it's slightly arranged in different ways, but we can see the same pattern throughout. So what we see first is we see one bone. All right. We see one bone that is highlighted in white with all of these. All right. So this is the humerus bone in all of these different animals. Okay. We then see two bones, which equate to the radius and the ulna. So we see that here in kind of this light pink color, and then we can also see it in the gray color as well. And we see this throughout. We see mini bones, which are the carpal bones. So we have we have 8 carpal bones in our wrist, and we'll look at those later. And then you see orange digits as they come out. All right. So this pattern that you see distributed across animals across the animal kingdom was first observed and first kind of recognized by a man named Sir Richard Owen in the 1800s. He looked at the pattern of various animals and noticed that they all had a similar theme, right? And so you can see this across crocodiles, birds, whales, bats, humans. You get this same basic pattern, all right? Okay, so if we look at another example and we look at a horse, okay? So we all know horses, we know equines and whatnot, and some other associated animals, right? So ones that we would consider um, a type of ungulate. So here we have a horse's leg, all right? Next to it, we see an illustration of our hand and our fingers. So what a horse actually is, or what the horse's legs are essentially an extended finger. All right. So they're essentially walking on what would be their middle finger. So here's our third metacarpal here. Here is their third metacarpal here. You can see radius and ulna up here where they're fused, carpal bones, that metacarpal as we said, a proximal phalanx, which is here the first bone of our finger, the middle bone of our finger you see here, and then their actual hoof would be their distal phalanx that we would have at the distal part of our finger, right? So if you think about a horse, so here's a horse and what it looks like these nice legs that come down, but in all reality, it actually looks something like this. Okay, so they're walking around and they're walking on an extended middle digit. All right. Okay, so moving on now. So when we look at specific bones, when we look at specific bones of what we'll call our appendicular skeleton, it's going to be the bones of our upper limb, the bones of our lower limb, and then the bones that directly support those bones. All right. So we'll look at what's called the shoulder girdle, sometimes called the pectoral girdle first, and then move on to the bones of the arm. And then we'll look at the pelvic girdle, and we'll look then at the bones of the leg. Okay. So as we do this, focus, because this is not this is not for lab, this is for lecture. Focus more so on the descriptive qualities of bones. So if a question was saying, what bone has this process? What bone has this projection? Know that it's whatever that bone happens to be. Whereas in a lab setting, it would be more, here's a picture of the bone, name this projection, name this hole, name this actual bone, right? So in lecture and lab, you'll see that there is some overlap, but there's also some differences as well, right? So we will begin first by looking at our pectoral girdle, right? So the pectoral girdle includes the bones that support the upper limb. So we're going to look at the clavicle, and we'll look at the scapula as well. All right, and then we'll kind of move on to then talking about the actual bones of the upper limb. All right, so when we look at the clavicle is is an is a S-shaped um, roughly S-shaped bone, and this is what we typically call our collarbone, right? And so this serves as a direct connection from the scapula, more posterior, to the sternum, more anterior. And this is the only direct bony connection between the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. Right, so we have sternum here, which is part of the axial. You have scapula and humerus over here, which is part of the appendicular, and then running between you have the clavicle, which is part of the appendicular. All right, so the clavicle serves as the connection between the axial and the appendicular skeletons. Okay. This serves as a brace to resist longitudinal compression. So based on the orientation and based on the shape, you kind of see that it has this S-shaped kind of sigmoidal shaped curve to it. This allows the clavicle to resist and withstand compression in a longitudinal plane. The clavicle is also extremely strong, so it takes a lot of force to break the clavicle. So you're more likely to dislocate it or move it out of position than to actually break it. All right. So we said here that our clavicle is the only direct connection to the axial skeleton. And we have two ends of the clavicle. You have that which is closest to the sternum, that's called the sternal end, and you have that which is closest to the acromion process of the scapula, which is called the acromial end. All right. So if you look here, here's the acromial end. It's this more long and rounded region that's closest to the acromion process. So this is the acromion process here of the scapula. And then on this end, you have the sternal end, which is a bit more flat and blunt. And this is what articulates with our clavicular notches of the manubrium of our sternum. Okay. Now, the clavicle is an important anatomical landmark because there are various vessels that are named, and actually a muscle named according to their position relative to the clavicle. So there are vessels called the subclavian vessels, the subclavian artery and vein, that run underneath the clavicle. All right. So when we move on now and we look at the scapula, we can see the other bone that makes up our pectoral girdle. So the scapula is what we kind of generally refer to as our shoulder blade, and it has various different surface landmarks, and you can actually feel some of these surface landmarks relatively easily on yourself. All right. So on the posterior side of the scapula, you have what's called the spine of the scapula. So here is the spine of our scapula right back here. On the superior and inferior aspects of the spine, you have spinous fossae. So you have a supraspinous fossa above the spine, you have an infraspinous fossa just below the spine. And in this, we have what are called rotator cuff muscles, and we'll look at some of those in the next slide. On the posterior side, you also see what's called the acromion process. So you see this right here. Now, many of these bone landmarks and some of the bones themselves are named according to the anatomical region that they lie in. So if you recall from anatomical terminology, the acromial region is this region kind of on the superior aspect of the shoulder. It's called the acromion region because in it you have the acromion process. Okay. A little more anteriorly, you have a region called the coracoid process. And remember, all processes serve as an attachment site for a muscle via a tendon. And then you have this large region here called the glenoid cavity. And the glenoid cavity is the socket for the ball and socket joint that is our shoulder. So for our glenohumeral joint. Okay. If we move here, we can also see the coracoid process, as we just mentioned, that allows for the attachment site of a couple of different muscles, including part of our biceps muscle. So our biceps brachii, the short head. And then as we mentioned in the last slide, these fossae. So you have a supraspinous fossa, you have an infraspinous fossa, and then if you look over this image on the right or on the left, you see a subscapular fossa. And so the muscles that reside in these fossae are named according to the fossae that they sit in, right? So the supraspinous muscle sits in the supraspinous fossa. The infraspinous muscle sits in the infraspinous fossa, and the subscapularis muscle sits in the subscapular fossa. All right. So those are three rotator cuff muscles. There's a fourth one that's called the teres minor, and it kind of sits on the posterior and inferior aspect of the scapula, just inferior to the infraspinous muscle. And we'll look at these muscles in more detail in in the lab whenever we get to them. Okay, but the rotator cuff muscles in general, for now, know these are what are responsible for both stabilizing the shoulder as well as serving as an attachment site for the humerus to the clavicle and providing some degree of movement for the shoulder as well. So if you have a rotator cuff tear or rotator cuff injury, moving the shoulder and moving the arm becomes much more difficult. Okay. So along with these muscles here, so these rotator cuff muscles, you also have many ligaments that sit around the shoulder as well. Okay. So the shoulder is a relatively mobile joint, and as we'll see whenever we do articulations and we do an articulation lecture, we'll see that the mobility of a joint and the stability of the joint are inversely related. So because the shoulder is extremely mobile, you can move it a lot, it is relatively unstable. Okay. But it is somewhat stabilized by the muscles that we just mentioned, as well as these ligaments. These ligaments are named just according to the bony landmarks that they attach to. So the coracoacromial ligament attaches to the coracoid process, so coraco, and the acromion process, acromial, right? Coracohumeral attaches to the coracoid process, coraco, and to the humerus, humeral, and same thing for glenohumeral. Attaches to the glenoid cavity or glenoid fossa, and then over to the humerus here. And you can see some of those right over here as well. Okay, so along this region of the shoulder, you can have usually you can have two types of injuries. Okay, you can have a separated shoulder and you can have a dislocated shoulder, and these are not the same thing. Okay, sometimes they're used interchangeably, but in reality they're actually different. Okay, so we're going to look first at a separated shoulder, and then we will look at an example of a dislocated shoulder. So a separated shoulder or shoulder separation has to do with the acromioclavicular ligament, okay, and the acromioclavicular joint. So the acromioclavicular ligament joint, that means the joint between the acromion process and the clavicle, okay. So if you look here on the right, you can see a nice clavicle. You can see the acromial end, and you can see where it would butt up next to the acromion process with a little bit of cartilage and a little bit of space in between. If we move over to this side, we also see our clavicle, but we see that it's raised up a little bit. We can see skin that's kind of protruding up where we don't really see it over here as much. And you see that there is a big or a larger separation between the acromion process and the acromial end of the clavicle. And so this is an example of a shoulder separation at what's called the AC joint. You may have heard of the AC joint. That just means the acromioclavicular joint. Okay, so the joint between the acromion process and the clavicle. This generally occurs due to some type of trauma, some type of physical force, or some type of physical impact to the shoulder area, and you typically can have it be put back in place. It doesn't always require surgery. You would have limited mobility of that joint, obviously, and it's not a joint that is, you don't necessarily move that joint a whole lot, but that joint moves a little bit whenever you're moving your glenohumeral joint, which is your shoulder joint proper. And so rest, ice, pain relievers can help with that. And so this is it's a relatively common injury. This area here, this AC joint, is much more likely to become separated than the sternoclavicular joint, which is the joint between the sternum and the clavicle. So you can see the outline of the sternum here, and then here is the clavicle here. So at this joint, this is a very strong joint. And so you're more likely to have the separation occur here at the AC joint than you are here at the sternoclavicular joint, right? So this is a shoulder separation. Now you also have a shoulder dislocation, and a shoulder dislocation has to do with the actual ball and socket joint of the shoulder, so the glenohumeral joint, and not the acromioclavicular joint. So here you can see both these joints. Here you see the clavicle, here you see the acromion process, and you see that joint. It looks okay. Here you see the head of the humerus. Here you see the glenoid cavity or the glenoid fossa of the scapula, and you see that these two are now disarticulated. They're no longer articulating together, and so this is an example of a shoulder dislocation. Again, this can generally occur due to some type of physical trauma. Maybe you fall down, you're skiing. So my dad, he dislocated his shoulder whenever he was skiing when he was younger. Some type of blunt trauma that forces this humerus to move out of the cavity move out of this glenoid fossa results in a shoulder dislocation. Sometimes this would require surgery, sometimes it can be put back into place via just manual manipulation. So manually pushing and manipulating the shoulder back into place. All right. Now, when you have severe shoulder dislocations, you can stretch out the ligaments, right? So if we go back here and we look at some of these ligaments and these capsules that surround the shoulder joint, if you dislocate it here severely enough, you can stretch out some of those ligaments in that capsule. You can damage the muscle. And so you may potentially be more prone to future shoulder dislocations as a result of the weakening of that supportive network. So the weakening of the muscles and the weakening of the connective tissue, ligaments and structures that help support that shoulder joint. Okay, so remember, shoulder dislocate or shoulder separation is the AC joint, acromioclavicular. Shoulder dislocation has to do with the actual glenohumeral joint. So the glenoid cavity here and what you'd see over here, and then the head of the humerus as well. All right. So we will stop there and we will pick up with part 2 by looking at the bones of the arm itself.